Eleanor Grayson sat on the creaking porch swing of her century-old home, the only place she'd ever called hers. The wood groaned under her slight frame, a familiar sound that had kept her company through decades of sunsets. At 75, her hands were weathered, her silver hair tied loosely in a bun, but her eyes still held a spark of defiance. The house, with its peeling white paint and overgrown rose bushes, was more than brick and mortar. It was her life's archive. Every scuff on the floorboards, every crack in the plaster, told a story of love, loss, and resilience. She'd raised 3 children here, buried a husband, and weathered countless storms, both literal and otherwise. But now, as the autumn leaves swirled across the yard, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that threatened to rip her roots from the earth. It started with whispers. Her children, Clara, Thomas, and Daniel, had always been close, or so she thought. They'd grown up in this house, their laughter echoing through the halls, their muddy footprints staining the rugs. But time had stretched them thin, scattering them to cities and ambitions far from the small town of Willow Creek. Clara, the eldest, was a lawyer in Chicago, sharp-tongued and always in a rush. Thomas, the middle child, ran a construction business in Denver, his calls to Eleanor brief and perfunctory. Daniel, the youngest, was a dreamer, always chasing schemes that never panned out, drifting from one coastal town to another. They visited rarely, their lives too full, they claimed, to linger in the past. Eleanor didn't mind. She had her garden, her books, and the memories embedded in every corner of the house. But lately, their calls had grown frequent, their tones syrupy with concern. "Mom, you're getting older," Clara would say, her voice crackling through the phone. "That house is too big for you now." Thomas chimed in during a rare visit, eyeing the sagging roofline. "It's a money pit. Mom, you could sell it. Move somewhere easier to manage." Daniel, ever the charmer, would wrap her in a hug and murmur, "We just want you to be safe, Mom." At first, Eleanor brushed it off. She'd lived alone since her husband, George, passed 10 years ago. She knew every quirk of the house, the way the furnace rattled, the window that stuck in the rain. She was fine. More than fine. She was home. Then came the papers. Clara arrived one crisp October morning, her briefcase gleaming under the porch light. "Mom, we've been talking," she said, sliding a stack of documents across the kitchen table. The words assisted living and power of attorney jumped out like daggers. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read, her coffee growing cold. "It's for your own good," Clara insisted, her eyes avoiding Eleanor's. "The house is falling apart, and you can't keep up. We found a nice facility nearby. You'd have your own room, meals, care." Eleanor's heart sank. A facility. A sterile box to store her until she faded away. She pushed the papers back, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "This is my home, Clara. I'm not leaving." Clara's face tightened, but she didn't argue. Not then. Instead, the pressure grew subtle, insidious. Thomas started sending contractors to assess the house, their estimates bloated with repairs Eleanor knew weren't urgent. Daniel called more often, his voice dripping with guilt trips. "Ma, we're worried about you. What if you fall? What if the roof caves in?" They painted her as frail, a burden, a woman too stubborn to see reason. But Eleanor saw through it. The house wasn't just her sanctuary, it was valuable. The land alone, 5 acres on the edge of Willow Creek, was worth a fortune now that developers were sniffing around. They didn't want her safe. They wanted her out. The The betrayal cut deeper than Eleanor could admit. She'd sacrificed everything for her children, nights spent sewing their clothes, mornings packing lunches, years pouring love into their dreams. And now, they were circling like vultures, eyeing the house she'd built with George, the home they'd all sworn to cherish. She stopped answering their calls. She ignored the letters from real estate agents, the glossy brochures for senior living communities that arrived in her mailbox. But the pressure didn't stop. It escalated. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor found a letter tucked under her door. It was from a lawyer, not Clara's firm, but one in town. The letter claimed her children had filed a petition to declare her incompetent, citing her refusal to maintain a safe living environment. If granted, they'd gain control of her finances, her property, her life. Eleanor's knees buckled. She sank into her armchair. The letter crumpled in her fist. They weren't just asking her to leave, they were trying to force her out, to strip her of her dignity. For what? A quick sale. A fat check to split 3 ways. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat by the fireplace, the embers casting shadows on the walls. She thought of George, his calloused hands building this house, his laughter filling it. She thought of her children, once small and clinging to her skirts, now strangers with their own agendas. And she thought of herself not as the frail old woman they painted, but as Eleanor Grayson, who'd survived wars, recessions, and heartbreak. She wasn't done fighting. By dawn, a plan had formed. It was reckless, perhaps, but it was hers. She wouldn't let them win. Not like this. She'd show them what it meant to underestimate her. Eleanor rose, her joints aching but her resolve ironclad. She pulled out her old address book, flipped to a name she hadn't called in years, and picked up the phone. If her family wanted her house, they'd have to chase it and her into the unknown. Eleanor's hands shook as she dialed the number, the rotary phone clicking softly in the quiet of her kitchen. The voice on the other end belonged to Margaret Hale, a real estate agent Eleanor had known since their book club days. Margaret was no nonsense, with a knack for discretion, a quality Eleanor needed now more than ever. "I want to sell the house," Eleanor said, her voice low but firm. Quickly and quietly. Margaret didn't pry. She agreed to meet the next day, promising to bring only trusted buyers. No developers. No fanfare. Eleanor hung up, her heart pounding. She wasn't just selling a house, she was severing ties, rewriting her story. The next morning, Margaret arrived with a single buyer in tow, a man named Samuel Carter. He was in his late 40s, with kind eyes and a weathered jacket that spoke of a life spent outdoors. He introduced himself as a retired teacher, looking for a quiet place to settle with his dog and his books. As they walked through the house, Eleanor watched him closely. He ran his fingers along the banister, paused at the stained glass window in the parlor, and smiled at the creaky floorboard in the hallway. "This place has soul," he said softly. Eleanor liked him instantly. He didn't see dollar signs, she saw a home. They sat at the kitchen table, Margaret laying out the paperwork. Samuel offered a fair price. Cash. No contingencies. "I can close in a week," he said, his gaze steady. Eleanor hesitated, her fingers brushing the table where George had carved their initials decades ago. Selling to Samuel meant letting go of everything, every memory, every echo of her past. But staying meant letting her children win, letting them dismantle her life piece by piece. She signed the papers, her signature shaky but resolute. "One condition," she added. "No one knows who bought it. Not my family. Not anyone." Margaret nodded, and Samuel agreed without question. The deal was set. Eleanor had 1 week to pack up her life and disappear. She didn't tell her children. She didn't tell anyone. Instead, she began sorting through her belongings with a quiet urgency. She kept it simple: a suitcase of clothes, a box of photos, George's old pocket watch, and a few books that had seen her through the darkest nights. The rest, the furniture, the dishes, the trinkets she left behind. They were part of the house, part of the life she was leaving. As she worked, memories flooded back. The living room where Clara had taken her first steps. The backyard where Thomas had built a treehouse, now weathered and leaning. The attic where Daniel had hidden his comic books, dreaming of adventures he'd never quite chase. Each memory was a pang, a reminder of what she'd hoped her family would be. But those hopes had crumbled under their greed, their betrayal. She didn't cry. She'd cried enough when George died. This time, her grief was a quiet, burning thing, fueling her resolve. By the third day, Eleanor had rented a small storage unit in a neighboring town, using cash and a fake name. She drove her old sedan, the one George had kept running for years, and stashed her keepsakes there. She didn't know where she'd go yet, maybe north, to the mountains, or south, where the air was warm year-round. She only knew she couldn't stay. Not in Willow Creek, where every street corner held a memory, where her children could find her and drag her back into their schemes. On the fifth day, Clara called. Eleanor let the phone ring, her heart twisting as the familiar chime filled the house. When the voicemail clicked on, Clara's voice was sharp, impatient. "Mom, we need to talk. The lawyer says you haven't responded to the petition. This isn't helping anyone." Eleanor deleted the message without listening to the rest. She didn't owe them explanations. They'd made their choice, and now she was making hers. That night, she sat on the porch swing one last time, the air crisp with the promise of winter. The stars were bright, unclouded, and she wondered if George was watching. "I'm doing this for us," she whispered, as if he could hear. "For what we built." The swing creaked, a soft agreement. She thought of Samuel, the stranger who'd soon call this place home. She hoped he'd love it as she had, that he'd hear its stories in the creaks and groans, that he'd tend the roses she'd planted with care. By the sixth day, Eleanor had her plan in place. She'd leave at dawn, before the town woke, before her children could suspect anything. She wrote a letter not to Clara, Thomas, or Daniel, but to Margaret, instructing her to mail it to them after the sale was final. The letter was brief, its words cutting. "You wanted the house. It's gone. So am I. Don't look for me." She sealed it, her hand steady now, and left it on the kitchen counter. As the sun rose on the seventh day, Eleanor stood in the doorway, her suitcase at her feet. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to change her mind. But she didn't. She locked the door, slipped the key into an envelope for Margaret, and drove away. The rearview mirror showed the house shrinking, its silhouette fading into the morning mist. Eleanor didn't look back. Eleanor's sedan rumbled down the highway, the engine's hum a steady companion as Willow Creek vanished behind her. She'd chosen a direction almost at random north, toward the mountains, where the air was sharp and the world felt vast. Her suitcase sat in the back seat, a modest collection of her life's essentials. The radio played softly, an old jazz station George had loved, and for the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt a flicker of freedom. It was tinged with sorrow, yes, but also with a strange, quiet thrill. She was 75, and she was starting over. She drove for hours, stopping only for gas and a coffee at a diner where no one knew her name. The anonymity was a balm. In Willow Creek, she'd been Eleanor Grayson Widow, mother, fixture of the community. Here, she was just a woman with silver hair and a story no one would ask to hear. She paid in cash, left no trace, and kept moving. By nightfall, she reached a small town called Pine Hollow, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachians. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, a single main street, a diner, a motel with a flickering neon sign. She checked in under the name Ellen Carter, borrowing Samuel's last name as a quiet nod to the man who'd taken her home. The motel room was sparse, with faded wallpaper and a lumpy bed, but Eleanor didn't mind. She sat at the small desk, opened her notebook, and began to write. Not a diarist, never been one for sentimentality but a plan. She had enough savings, carefully tucked away over the years, to live modestly. George had left her a small pension, and the sale of the house had added a substantial sum, wired to a new account under her assumed name. She didn't need much. A small apartment, maybe. A garden to tend. A life where no one could take her choices away. Back in Willow Creek, the sale closed without a hitch. Margaret, true to her word, kept Eleanor's secret. Samuel moved in, his dog bounding through the yard, his books stacked on the shelves Eleanor had left behind. The house came alive again, its creaks and groans now telling new stories. But the news of the sale didn't stay quiet for long. Clara was the first to find out, driving to the house unannounced when Eleanor stopped answering her calls. She found the lights on, a stranger's car in the driveway, and Samuel tending the roses. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice sharp with disbelief. Samuel, calm and unyielding, handed her Margaret's letter. Clara tore it open, her face paling as she read Eleanor's words. "You wanted the house. It's gone. So am I. Don't look for me." Clara's shock turned to fury. She called Thomas and Daniel, her voice trembling as she relayed the news. "She sold it. She sold our house to some nobody and disappeared." Thomas, ever practical, demanded to know how it happened, how Eleanor had pulled it off without them noticing. Daniel, for once silent, felt a pang of guilt he couldn't shake. They'd underestimated her. All of them. They'd seen her as old, weak, a problem to be solved. Now, she was a ghost, slipping through their fingers. They hired a private investigator, a man with a cheap suit and a knack for digging up secrets. He traced Eleanor's car to the storage unit, but the trail went cold there. The fake name, the cash transactions covered her tracks too well. Clara raged. Thomas calculated. And Daniel drank, each grappling with the void Eleanor had left. They didn't talk about the petition, the lawyer, the way they'd tried to force her hand. They didn't talk about the greed that had driven them, the assumption that the house was theirs to claim. They only talked about finding her, as if that would fix what they'd broken. In Pine Hollow, Eleanor settled into a rhythm. She rented a small cottage on the edge of town, its porch overlooking a valley where the mountains rose like sentinels. She planted herbs in pots, read novels by lamplight, and walked the trails each morning, her steps slow but steady. She made no friends. Not yet. But she didn't feel alone. The mountains were her company, vast and unchanging, a reminder that some things endured. She thought of her children often, though the ache dulled with time. She wondered if they'd learned anything, if they'd ever see her not as a possession to manage, but as a woman who'd loved them fiercely, who deserved better. She didn't hate them. She couldn't. But she wouldn't go back. Not to them. Not to Willow Creek. Not to a life where her voice was drowned out by their ambitions. One evening, as the sun painted the valley gold, Eleanor sat on her porch with a cup of tea. She opened George's pocket watch, its ticking a soft echo of his presence. "I did it, George," She whispered, "I'm free." The mountains stood silent, their peaks catching the last light. For the first time in years, Eleanor smiled without reservation, her heart light with the knowledge that she'd reclaimed her story. Months passed, and Eleanor's life in Pine Hollow took on a quiet rhythm. The cottage became her sanctuary, its walls bare, but for a few framed photos she'd salvaged her and George on their wedding day. The kids as toddlers, their faces bright with innocence. She tended her herbs, learned the names of the birds that flocked to her feeder, and struck up cautious conversations with the diner's owner, a woman named Ruth who didn't ask too many questions. Eleanor wasn't hiding. Not exactly. But she guarded her past like a treasure too fragile to share. The townsfolk knew her as Ellen Carter, a widow with a soft smile and a knack for growing basil. That was enough. She'd sold the sedan, trading it for a used bicycle she rode into town. The physical effort grounded her, each pedal stroke a reminder of her strength. At 75, she wasn't the frail figure her children had painted. Her hands, though arthritic, still pulled weeds and turned pages. Her mind, sharp as ever, pieced together a new life from the fragments of the old. She wrote letters to no one, burning them in a small fire pit behind the cottage, a ritual to let go of the anger that lingered. She didn't want to carry it anymore. Back in Willow Creek, the search for Eleanor faltered. The private investigator ran out of leads, his reports growing thinner with each passing week. Clara, Thomas, and Daniel met at the house Samuel's house, now hoping to find clues. Samuel let them in, his kindness tinged with wariness. They wandered the rooms, their footsteps echoing in a space that felt both familiar and foreign. Clara ran her fingers over the kitchen table, remembering Sunday dinners. Thomas stared at the fireplace, where he'd once burned his hand trying to roast marshmallows. Daniel lingered in the attic, the ghosts of his comic books still there. They left empty-handed. The letter's words burned into their minds. "Don't look for me." Clara threw herself into work, her anger a shield against the guilt that gnawed at her. Thomas grew distant, his calls to his siblings curt. Daniel, haunted by Eleanor's absence, started writing her letters he'd never sent, pouring out apologies he hadn't the courage to voice. They didn't talk about the house anymore, or the money they'd hoped to gain. It was a wound too raw, a mirror reflecting their shame. In Pine Hollow, Eleanor found unexpected solace in routine. She volunteered at the library, shelving books and reading to children on Saturday mornings. Their laughter reminded her of her own kids, before time and distance had carved a chasm between them. She didn't dwell on it, though. She focused on the present, the weight of a book in her hands, the chatter of the kids, the crisp mountain air. She was building something new, something hers. One day, a letter arrived, forwarded from Margaret. It was from Daniel, his handwriting shaky. "Ma, I'm sorry." It began. "We were wrong. I was wrong. I didn't see you. Not really. I miss you. Please come back." Eleanor read it twice, her throat tight. She wanted to believe him, to believe there was still a thread connecting them. But she'd learned the cost of trust. She set the letter aside, unsure if she'd reply. Not yet. Winter came, blanketing Pine Hollow in snow. Eleanor's cottage was warm, the fireplace crackling as she read by its light. She'd started writing again. Not letters, but stories, fragments of her life woven into fiction. She wrote about a woman who'd built a home, loved fiercely, and walked away when the world turned against her. It wasn't therapy, exactly, but it was healing. Each word was a step toward understanding, toward forgiving not her children, but herself, for the years she'd spent hoping they'd change. One evening, Ruth from the diner stopped by with a pie. her excuse for checking in. They sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, the stars sharp above. Ruth didn't ask about Eleanor's past, but she shared her own, a daughter lost to addiction, a life rebuilt from ashes. Eleanor listened, her heart opening just a fraction. Maybe, she thought, this was what family could be, not blood, but understanding, a shared recognition of life's weight. As spring approached, Eleanor made a decision. She wrote to Daniel, a single page, her words careful but honest. I'm safe, she wrote. I'm happy, but I can't come back. Not now. Maybe not ever. I hope you find your way. She mailed it from a post office 2 towns over. No return address. It wasn't closure. Not fully, but it was enough for now. Eleanor stood on her porch, the valley greening below. The mountains loomed, steadfast, their silence a comfort. She wasn't the woman who'd left Willow Creek, nor the one who'd raised her children. She was Ellen Carter, a name she'd chosen, a life she'd carved from the wreckage. And for the first time, she felt whole. Spring in Pine Hollow brought wildflowers to the valley, their colors a quiet rebellion against the long winter. Eleanor's cottage bloomed with life, her herb garden thrived. And the porch swing, a recent addition, swayed gently in the breeze. She'd settled into her new identity as Ellen Carter, though traces of Eleanor Grayson lingered in her habits, the way she folded her napkins, the lullabies she hummed while watering her plants. At 76, she felt a clarity she hadn't known in years. The betrayal of her children still stung, but it no longer defined her. She was more than their mother, more than their victim. She was herself. Her days were full, not with grand adventures, but with small, meaningful moments. She joined a knitting group at the library, her fingers slow but steady as she crafted scarves for the winter drive. The other women, most younger, welcomed her without pressing for details. They sensed her strength, her quiet resilience, and that was enough. Ruth became a regular visitor, their conversations stretching late into the night. Eleanor shared fragments of her story, not the house, not the betrayal, but the love she'd poured into her garden, the husband whose laugh still echoed in her dreams. Ruth listened, her own scars a silent bridge between them. In Willow Creek, the search for Eleanor had all but stopped. Clara, Thomas, and Daniel had fractured, their guilt a wedge driving them apart. Clara buried herself in cases, her ambition a mask for the emptiness she felt. Thomas sold his business, moved to a smaller town, and stopped answering his siblings' calls. Daniel, still drifting, carried Eleanor's letter in his wallet, its words a weight he couldn't shed. He'd written again, but the letters came back undelivered. He didn't know where she was, only that she'd outsmarted them all. One day, a package arrived at Eleanor's cottage, forwarded by Margaret. It was a small box, no return address. Inside was a photograph, one she'd thought lost, of her and George dancing at a town fair, their faces lit with joy. A note was tucked beneath, in Daniel's handwriting. I found this in the attic. It's yours. Eleanor's breath caught. She traced George's face, the memory sharp and sweet. She didn't cry, but she held the photo close, letting it anchor her to a past she could still cherish. She wrote to Daniel again, her words softer this time. Thank you for the photo, she began. I'm not ready to see you, but I'm glad you remember who we were. She mailed it, again with no return address, and felt a weight lift. Forgiveness wasn't a gift she owed them, but she could choose peace for herself. She burned the note's draft in her fire pit, the flames curling around her past, setting it free. Eleanor's stories grew bolder, her notebook filling with tales of women who defied expectation. who walked away and found themselves. She read one aloud at the library, her voice steady, the room silent with attention. The children clapped. The adults nodded. And Ruth squeezed her hand. "You've got a gift," Ruth said later. "Over coffee." Eleanor smiled, her heart full. She wasn't just surviving, she was creating. Summer arrived, and with it, a letter from Margaret. Samuel was thriving in the house. She wrote. The roses bloomed. The roof was fixed. And he'd started a book club, filling the rooms with laughter. Eleanor read the letter twice, picturing her home alive again. It didn't hurt as she'd feared. It felt right, like passing a torch. She wrote back, asking Margaret to thank Samuel, to tell him the house was in good hands. One evening, as fireflies danced in the valley, Eleanor sat on her swing, George's pocket watch in her hand. She thought of her children, not with anger, but with a distant hope. Maybe one day, they'd understand. Maybe they'd see her as she was a woman who'd loved them, who'd fought for her dignity, who'd built a new life from the ashes of the old. She didn't need their approval. She had her own. The mountains stood watch, their peaks softened by dusk. Eleanor closed her eyes, the swing creaking beneath her. She was home not in a house, but in herself. And that, she knew, was enough. Years passed, and Eleanor's life in Pine Hollow deepened, its roots twining around her heart. At 78, she moved slower, her arthritis a constant companion, but her spirit remained unbowed. The cottage was her haven, its walls now lined with books and drawings from the library children. Her herb garden had grown into a small Eden, its scents mingling with the mountain air. She'd become a fixture in town, known as Ellen, the woman who told stories, who listened, who seemed to carry a quiet wisdom in her smile. No one asked about her past, and she offered only what she chose: a tale of a garden, a love, a life well lived. She kept writing, her stories now collected in a worn notebook she planned to leave to the library. They weren't for publication, but for the children who'd listen, for the women in her knitting group who'd nod in recognition. Each story was a piece of her, a way to make sense of the years, the losses, the triumphs. She wrote about a woman who'd walked away from betrayal, who'd found strength in solitude, who'd learned that family wasn't always blood, but sometimes the people who saw you clearly. In Willow Creek, time had softened the edges of her children's guilt. Clara, now in her 50s, had left her law firm, burned out by ambition. She volunteered at a community center, teaching kids to read. And sometimes, she'd see her mother's patience in her own hands. Thomas, settled in a quiet town, had started gardening, his roses a clumsy tribute to Eleanor's. Daniel, sober now, wrote poetry, his words raw with regret and hope. They didn't speak of the house or the petition, but they carried Eleanor's absence like a shared scar. One spring, Daniel found a Cluia postmark on one of Eleanor's letters, carelessly forwarded by Margaret. Pine Hollow. He didn't tell Clara or Thomas. He drove alone, his heart pounding, the photograph of his parents dancing tucked in his pocket. He found the cottage, its porch swing swaying, but Eleanor wasn't there. A neighbor said she'd gone to the library. Daniel waited, his courage faltering. When she returned, her silver hair catching the sunlight, he froze. She looked different, stronger, freer, her eyes bright with a life he hadn't known. He didn't approach her. He left a note on her doorstep. I saw you. You're happy. That's enough. I'm sorry. Eleanor found the note at dusk. She read it, her fingers tracing Daniel's words. She didn't cry, but she sat on her swing, the mountains watching, and let the ache settle. She didn't need to see him, to hear his apologies. She'd made her peace. But the note was a bridge, however fragile, to a past she could finally lay to rest. She wrote one last story, her hand steady despite the pain in her joints. It was about a woman who'd vanished, not to escape, but to become. She read it at the library, her voice clear, the room full. Ruth was there, tears in her eyes. The children clapped. The adults lingered. And Eleanor felt a completeness she hadn't known she'd been seeking. That summer, she felt ill-quiet sickness, the kind that creeps rather than crashes. She didn't fight it, not out of surrender, but acceptance. She'd lived fully, on her terms. Ruth stayed close, bringing soup, reading her stories back to her. Eleanor gave her the notebook, the pocket watch, the photo of her and George. "Keep them safe," she said. Ruth nodded, her hand warm around Eleanor's. When Eleanor passed, Pine Hollow mourned quietly. The library held a reading of her stories, the children's voices carrying her words. Ruth planted a rosebush by the cottage, its blooms red as the ones Eleanor had loved. In Willow Creek, Daniel felt a shift, a loss he couldn't name. He drove to Pine Hollow again, found the cottage empty, the rosebush blooming. A neighbor told him Ellen had passed, her stories now part of the town's heart. Daniel returned home, the photograph heavier in his pocket. Clara and Thomas learned later, their grief private, their regrets unspoken. They didn't know her stories, her garden, her swing, but they knew she'd been free. Eleanor's legacy wasn't the house she'd left, but the life she'd built. In Pine Hollow, her stories lived on, read by children, shared by friends. The mountains stood watch, their silence a testament to a woman who'd vanished, not to disappear, but to be found.